Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Talent Gap Fireside Chat, where we talk about causes of and solutions to the talent gap. I'm your host, Pete Strauss, and joining me today is Patrick Benoit. He is formerly the Global CISO for Brinks. Welcome, Patrick.
Thank you. Hey, Pete, it's good to be with you.
Thanks for being here. Could you give our audience a little background on yourself and your career?
Sure. It's been forever in technology. You know, I a long time ago was in the military, and they say you're never X. So I still share that in my DNA. But for a long time, I worked through various aspects of technology, and from software development to infrastructure, leading numerous different teams, including cybersecurity. Most recently, as you said, I was the global CISO at Brinks Incorporated, so guns, guards, ammo, moving cash, that kind of stuff. And prior to that, had worked in companies like CBRE, heading global GRC and the BISO program. Experian as a business information officer, business information security officer, and deputy CISO at a spinoff from Experian, and then Dell Services as various roles at Dell Services in technology, including as a customer delivery executive.
Awesome. What was it like doing cybersecurity for a physical security company?
Well, fortunately, they separate the physical security, so they have folks that are much more skilled at that aspect, handling the physical. So it actually, as much as companies would love to think that they're very unique, most companies are not as unique as they think. And so you stick to basics, and basic principles almost always apply. And frankly, most companies that I've been at, they have plenty of work to do in the basics and in the fundamentals, that getting stylistic or nuanced is not generally that necessary.
Yeah, and I would imagine you make a pretty large impact just getting the fundamentals right. It kind of reminds me of the Pareto principle. You get 80% of your results from 20% of your effort type of thing.
Exactly.
What about the hiring front? Would you say the talent gap is a real thing? And if so, what would you say it looks like?
So I think there are a lot of things at play there. And so whether you call it a talent gap or not, lends itself a lot towards your own perspective. I think in many companies, probably 10 billion or below, it may be a little more difficult. And the reason I say that is we've kind of created a talent imbalance through the view for the last 10 years that best in breed was everything, and we got to have best in breed. And then we had a very entrepreneurial drive within cybersecurity that created, frankly, lots of 1% solutions, or 2% solutions, however you want to look at them, from vendors and they're very, very strong solutions. But again, they're 1%, which means, I've got to have 100 people to have the total solution. And most companies, say 10 billion or below, aren't going to have 100 people to do those sorts of things. So we get into a situation where these startups hired the best and brightest because they had investment sourcing that was providing trying to grow the business, and so they were able to throw a little more money at some of the really high quality engineers we have in the domain, and pay them a little more than what the normal average would be. So they hired them all up, trained them on their 1% or 2% solution. And now we're cycled through to a point where a lot of those folks are coming back out into general enterprise again. And again, as a mid-sized company, you can't afford to hire somebody that can only do one thing. One-trick ponies don't last. There are some situations where you don't have a choice, but generally, you need somebody that can be a little more general. So I think a couple of things are happening as a result of that. Enterprise can't afford to pay them the same amount of money that they're asking for. So we're seeing a lot of candidates that are out there working multiple jobs because they want to keep the same amount of money. And so and sometimes they tell their company and sometimes they don't. And sometimes you have where there is no impact, and sometimes you have impact across both sets of companies. So I think that's a challenge. And I think that that's going to stabilize as the industry is becoming more and more oriented towards platform as opposed to point solutions. Now, we got to make sure we don't imbalance the other direction, because there's not a single platform that does everything. But I think we're trying to move to the center of that. And as we do, we'll be able to say, hey, do you know X platform? Yes. And that satisfies, 5 of the 10 tools that I use. And so now I don't need 5 people, I need 2 people to manage that. So I think that's all coming into play. Long story to say, yeah, there's some difficulty. I don't know if I'd call it a true gap, but there's some difficulty for sure.
Yeah, it seems like there's some consolidation happening in security. Like you mentioned, there were a lot of startups creating these platforms and products when money was so cheap and investment was flowing freely and things like that. And that's not so much the case anymore, at least from the last numbers I've seen. So yeah, it's a completely different environment. And obviously hiring has evolved along with that. What I'm seeing in the market is a ton of people currently on the market looking for jobs and a ton of jobs, but there just seems to be kind of a giant matching problem the way I described it. The two sides aren't able to find each other, and there's all of these hard to sort of qualify roadblocks standing between them. And I often say I think it's a lot of people and process problem versus a technology problem, at least when it comes to matching talent to opportunity. What's been your experience in that domain in hiring? Have you found it relatively easy to hire or challenging?
It kind of depends on which area we're talking about. I've experienced in the past some issues with some of the specialty areas like identity and access management. I don't know why exactly, but for some reason, that seems to be an area where we see a lot of let me take 3 jobs and I'll do them remotely and I'll sort them out myself, but I won't tell anybody about it. At some point, somebody is losing productivity on that deal. There's just no way you can do 3 jobs like that. But otherwise, matching talent has not been that bad. The hardest thing, frankly, is yes, you have 100 resumes come in within a day for any job you post, and that I think lends itself towards this idea of we have excessive churn still going on right now. So we have a lot of movement, and I'm not sure it's the kind of movement we want. We're seeing movement for people trying to, find that unicorn job that does everything perfectly. And it seems like the workforce is much less tolerant of, hey, for example, hey, I have to come in a day a week or 2 days a week, or hey, I'm not going to give you, stock sharing, or hey, I expect you to dress up when you come into the office a little bit differently. Or there's a little bit of travel. So there's this I think movement causing churn where everybody's trying to find perfection in that Xanadu kind of scenario, which I don't know if that exists, first of all, but second of all, our tolerance level's so low for any little thing. People are moving for just, my boss was upset with me one time, and then they go look for a job and they move, and that's creating this every 12 to 18 month churn of people, which means you have exactly what you were talking about. You have hundreds of people that are out there that are candidates, but you also have hundreds of jobs, and you have a mismatch problem. So I think the mismatch problem is because of our intolerance and because of our perception of what the perfect job should be.
Yeah, and I think there's been a proliferation of candidates too because of big tech laying a bunch of people off. Companies that even the big banks, companies that traditionally would have been viewed as quote unquote stable, where people are starting to realize, hey, it's not actually as stable as I thought it was. So I think what we have is a lessening investment in employees from employers and a lessening investment in employers from employees.
Well, we actually have some affirmative movement too to do things like larger companies that are looking to reduce their total payroll, and so they have potentially long-term employees. And now with the leasing on buildings and things like that, a method that I've seen used to reduce that higher paid workforce is to say, you will be in the office 5 days a week. And by doing that, they achieve two things. First, they use the space that they can't get out of that 10 or 20 year lease for anyway. And then secondly, they probably lose some percentage of their highest paid, because those highest paid employees are not going to accept that as easily generally as newer employees, younger meaning newer to the workforce employees. And so they basically turn over that whole workforce, and they hire in from the bottom of the pay scale and the bottom of the workforce. They reduce their salary, they reduce their total comp and everything like that. So I think that's actually tactical that and strategic that companies are doing. I think we're going to start to see some play too with companies that are not hiring as much because, at least from a CISO perspective, we're much more attuned to the idea of, can we go to a managed service? Because we're tired of churning. We're tired of trying to hire, level 1 cyber risk analysts or level 1 cyber analysts or, whatever the case is. So rather than churn that every year, having to hire people, let's just put that burden on the vendor. So let's have, MDR, let's have managed GRC, let's have, managed everything at that tier 1 for your entire cybersecurity program, and let somebody else deal with that churn. And that's going to create pools of resources, but it's also going to drive the cost down some too, because you'll have pools of resources at vendors. And so some of that comp will start to level out as well.
Yeah, that's a great point. If we can move more towards the managed security service model, and two, that opens up more of a pipeline to train the junior folks, which I think the industry has always kind of been lacking. The only companies that, on average, the companies that can really justify hiring the junior folks is the companies that know that they're going to get their money back, because those folks are revenue generating. It's much more difficult to build a junior entry level pipeline when you're a corporation and you need to build an internal security team, and you're limited on resources and headcount and stuff like that. Whereas if like I said, you're an MSSP, it's an easier business case.
Yeah, what a great pipeline you could create as an MSP like that, where you go to the colleges and you create an internship pipeline, and you bring people in and say, hey, here's a 6-month paid but relatively inexpensively paid internship for 6 months, for a year, and then we'll guarantee you, as long as you perform and you meet your stuff, that you'll turn over into a full FTE right after that. So you've maybe extended that. Now you've created a 1 to 2 year minimum kind of pipeline of resource, and hopefully reduce that churn, because now you have new people coming in on the bottom of that all the time, while the others are starting to cycle out. And some percentage of those will cycle and stay, at the higher levels within your MSP organization, and the others will cycle out and become the tier 2 resources in the enterprise.
Yeah, that's great. How do you decide what functions to outsource as an enterprise or, a corporation, and which that you absolutely need to have in-house?
I think it's all, frankly, in my mind, I look at it based on, I used to do a model a long time ago where I'd say, okay, my tier 3, 4 type people, the really skilled folks, have a responsibility to understand the process and the organization, to help to document that process and organization and take the friction out of it. And then once that's documented, it gets taken down to the tier 2 resources, whose responsibility is to execute that process or procedure or implementation until such time where it is very smooth and very rote. And then anything within that process that doesn't require specific critical thinking from a business point of view, you take that and you document that really well in checklist form and everything, and that gets pushed down to the tier 1. Well, so that tier one, anything that's tier one, anything that you can say is rote, repetitive, doesn't require critical thinking, can be very programmatic in nature. You either want to automate it or you want to push it out. And so that's the decision. That's how I make that decision.
Yeah, that's great. And it seems like a pretty common tactic to have somebody senior on your internal team that can really manage potentially the relationship with the MSSP and the more junior folks in their managed SOC. So yeah, that's a great approach. I'm drawing a blank. I had something else.
Well, I was just going to say, and the thing we need to start thinking about as CISOs more too, and I know some are out there doing this, but I still don't hear it enough, is we've done that on the tech side quite a bit. But I don't think there's a CISO out there that would deny the fact that we are spending more and more and more time on GRC. We're spending much more time on compliance, especially. But risk and compliance and governance, they're getting us. They're eating our lunch. Most teams, I think, probably see a third to half of their total cyber program team is going to be GRC oriented. So if that's the case, how come there aren't more companies out there that are offering MDR for GRC, managed GRC, MGRC, whatever you want to call it, and let create this whole tier vendor that says, yeah, we'll take care of chasing the evidence. And I know some vendors do that for third party risk management, but I'm talking about just in general. Yes, we will have a list of those people we need that are control owners. We'll chase the evidence for you. We'll make sure the evidence meets the standard that you've published for me. We'll check it off. We'll make the phone calls. We'll answer all of the questions based on the database of answers that you have for us. And then once we have all that packetized and brought together, then we'll hand it up to a tier two resource, a tier two analyst to review it, to execute it, to manage it, to work with the auditors, whatever the case is. And I'm just not seeing a lot of vendor movement in managed GRC yet. But I think it could be a big area.
Yeah, I actually have seen a couple of vendors pop up for that. They call it continuous compliance. There's a couple of applications that manage that whole process, and then I'm guessing they're doing some sort of managed service along with it.
Right.
But yeah, it's really not ubiquitous at this point. Remember what I was going to say from earlier. When you're talking about outsourcing some of your security functions, I think it makes even more sense when you have all these disparate sub-disciplines within security. And I think the tendency for corporations is to want to hire one person with limited resources and headcount to do everything.
Right.
But the field is a mile wide and a mile deep. It's not something where you can get somebody that is a complete expert in everything, in
right.
GRC and security operations and vulnerability management and pen testing. You're not going to find one person with all of those things. Yet some of the job descriptions I see
right.
are expecting to find that person. But if you have, ideally less than a ton of different vendors to handle all of these sub-disciplines of security, ideally you'd have, I guess, some sort of crosstalk and not too many suppliers for all of your security needs. So yeah, that's a great approach. And like we've mentioned, even with the GRC companies, again, pipeline for more people to enter the field. And I think a lot of people don't consider GRC as a way into the field, but it's certainly a good one, and I think less competitive than some of the security operations.
Sure, absolutely.
Oh, cut out there for a second.
Oh, there you go. I don't know why my mic mute, but yes, and I think part of our challenge is in leadership is that we tend to think like Lord of the Rings or something, that we should have one person that manages it all, like you said, and we look at that in the managed service point of view too. We want one company that does all this managed service. Well, so if I have to have, say I have 10 tools and I had to have 10 different people to manage those tools, well, rather than having 10 different people, why don't I have 2 or even 3 vendors that can manage multiple of those tools with their own resources. They can eliminate single points of failure and things like that. So at least I go from 10 to 3. That's an improvement. And I think there's another opportunity out there for vendors too. I have not yet heard of a retained service for talent either. Now, I'm not talking about, hey, I can call you up, Pete, and say, hey, I need somebody. You'll give me a set of candidates, and then I'll go interview them and hire them, and it takes 2 to 4 weeks to get somebody on board. I'm talking about, we have an agreement where I pay a retainer, much like a law firm, and I pay Pete X thousands of dollars, his company, and then all of a sudden I lose a critical person on my staff that is XYZ skill. But I've already arranged with you to make sure that you know our business, and that's part of the retainer, knowing our business and knowing our tools and having access to them. Then you don't do anything else but stay aware. And when I have this critical need, I pick up the phone and go, Pete, I got to have somebody on Monday. And you go, no problem, gotcha. And your people come into play immediately. And then they're up while we start doing the background hiring to rehire the position that I need rehired, or 2 positions or whatever. And then when the new position gets, and you get paid on a time and materials basis, some reduced rate as part of the retainer. And then, I get my new hire in, we get them trained up for 30 days. Your team can actually be part of that training process and learning process. And then your team ramps down and goes back into just awareness mode. So that whole retained service point of view, I think, is missing out there too.
That's interesting. Yeah, you could even call it like talent backup or something like that.
Yes, talent safety net, whatever.
Yeah. All right. Well, if anybody's listening that is entrepreneurial minded, there you go. There's a great idea. What about when you absolutely need to have that full-time person on board on your team? How have you found the relationship with recruiters and HR, and how have you managed that?
So I take the view of that. What I do is, obviously I use my talent folks a lot. They're very, very critical to what's going on, because frankly, there's just no way I'm going to, sift through the hundreds or many hundreds of resumes that may come in for any single job. So I take kind of a two-pronged approach, a two-pronged attack. One is I use them to get the public word out and to do all that screening based on what I've told them. I give them specific criteria that, this is an absolute, this is an okay, this, you can almost line up the 5 or 6 skills that you're looking for, or critical areas, and say, if they have this, rate them from 1 to 5 on how much experience they have. And 0 is they don't have it at all. And 5 is they have it for 10 years, or whatever the criteria is. But you can formulate that and let them use that to screen through the candidates for you. That's the bulk. That's where I use them a lot. Then I turn to my network, and I put word out on my network. LinkedIn obviously is the most obvious place to do that. And I then work those referred candidates directly, and I'll take it in and then give it to the talent and say, here's a referred candidate. I want to speak to them. And so I'm getting 2 sets. I'm getting the referred candidates that probably are a little better screened on the front end, because they're coming from people that I know and may be people that I know. But then I'm getting that pool of resources, so I don't just miss the opportunity for those people that don't happen to know me somehow. And so I take both of those together and feed them through talent that way, and then work through a multi-level interview process after the recruiter has done the screening. I always ask talent to have the comp discussion up front, because there's nothing worse, as you know, than getting down to the very end and saying, man, this is the person I want, and you're 20 or 30% different in comp, and you can't resolve that, and so you go back to square one again. So that's my process.
That's great. It's so funny you mentioned to make sure that you're not 20, 30% off. That's almost exactly the terminology sort of the word track I use when I talk to candidates on that first call. It's, I just want to make sure we get down to numbers so expectations are set. Just want to make sure we're not $20,000 off in the end, because that's not a good look for anybody.
Right.
So yeah, absolutely crucial to have that call about compensation in the first call. But what's your opinion on salaries on job postings? That's something that I may have a little bit of an unpopular opinion on, but curious your take.
Yeah, that's multiple philosophies on that, and if you think about it, I think it's coming into play as we become more of a world economy, global, because in the U.S. at least my experience has been the U.S. is the least likely for people to talk about salary with each other among peers. I don't know the history of exactly why that evolved that way, but the sharing of that kind of information is much less prevalent in the U.S. So now I think as we're getting more and more folks that are coming from various cultures where that was not in any way taboo, we're starting to see that happen. From a candidate point of view, like if I'm out looking for something, I would at least like somebody to tell me, hey, here's the range of total comp, or here's the range of direct comp. Because frankly, if I'm 30 or 40% off, I may not waste my time at all. Excuse me. I may not waste my time at all. So I'm not opposed to seeing that. I think at least maybe a top end, a bottom and a top end kind of thing. Because if the bottom end is so high, somebody may apply anyway. But if I look at somebody and I go, well, wait, you've never been beyond a maybe first level manager role, and now you're applying for a senior director role. That clearly is going to be a 100% increase in salary. Man, you're going to have to impress me a different way for me to do that. So I'm not opposed to having the ranges put out there.
Yeah, one issue I see as it relates to just human psychology is, and this is just my experience being a recruiter and being boots on the ground, the first person that people talk to. It's very much nobody wants to admit that they're not worth the top of the range. So
that's true.
That seems to be the default, and then the recruiter inherently has to talk that person down. And nobody likes to feel like they're being lowballed or, anything like that. So I suppose that would be the downside. I also see, the upside of pay transparency and setting expectations and not wasting people's time and stuff like that. I tend to default to, let's have that conversation on the first phone call. Let's take all of the elements in the equation into account. Benefits, we can talk about equity if there's equity. We can talk about the role itself, whether you're going to like your boss or not, that sort of thing. And all of that kind of feeds into retention too. It's one thing to make sure the money's right, but it's another thing to make sure that you're actually satisfied in that role and
Sure.
You're going to stick around for a long period of time. So kind of going back to what we had talked about earlier, there seems to be less investment in companies, less investment in employees, and people are moving on more often. What do you think we can do on the hiring side to improve retention and help keep some of these people that are not so easily satisfied, sticking around?
Well, and by and large, there's the old saying that people don't leave companies, they leave leaders. And so I think we have the opportunity to continue to grow our leaders in the cybersecurity world. I think that in some ways, we're still evolving and maturing, very similar to the way CIOs evolved and matured. I think we have a lot of CISOs at companies that, until PCI came around, they put in the firewall rules. And then PCI came out and somebody turned around and goes, oh my God, we got to have a named CISO. And they went, oh, Pete, you're doing the firewall rules. You're our new CISO. And I appreciate the fact that that person then parlayed that into, CISO at the next bigger company, CISO at the next bigger company, CISO at the next bigger company. But I don't know if that wasn't a disservice from that maturing of leadership point of view. And so I think we have the opportunity to improve our leadership training. We do a horrific job of teaching emotional IQ in businesses. We all run around talking about DEI and diversity, equity, and inclusion and all that kind of stuff like that. But what we don't talk about is the way we make those kinds of things happen is to teach leaders to have strong emotional IQ and to learn how to lead properly. To use things like extreme ownership, where if you do something wrong, my first question should not be, why did you do that? My first question should be, what didn't I teach you? What didn't I show you that you needed to know to have that quality? And those kinds of things are what changes the character and makes people want to stay in companies, to stay with those leaders. We need to get over ourselves. When we were talking about the compensation, if somebody comes in and say the range is $100 to $150,000, and somebody comes in and goes, "Oh yeah, $150,000," we need to not be offended by that. Or if we ask them openly, he who speaks first loses. So if we ask them, "What's your range?" and they say 200, and we know it's 150, our response should not be, "Oh my God, there's no way." Our response should be, "Oh, well, that's interesting. What makes you think that what is it that you have that puts you at that level compared to the industry level, which is 150?" And not take these things personally. I've seen way too many recruiters and way too many hiring managers that get indignant because somebody asked for more than they really were entitled, deserved, or whatever. Well, we don't have a good knowledge of what the market looks like. We're not, most people aren't marketing experts in terms of the job market. So they're just doing the best they can. And since we don't share that information openly in the US with each other, how would you know? How would you know that a senior director might be more of a $180,000 to $200,000 person in a certain size company, in a certain geography? How would you know that? So we just need to get over ourselves and start learning those ways to make the team to be better leaders and make people want to stay on the team, not just leave because they don't like the leader.
Yeah, that's a great point. And it seems to me that you might advocate for more listening as well, asking open-ended questions and really listening to the answers people give. A lot of what I do in my screening calls as a recruiter is ask those deeper questions, really dig past the surface and really listen to what they're telling me. Somebody might tell you that 200K salary, but you don't know the full story behind why they're asking for that 200K salary. It could be they saw something on salary.com. It could be they heard their friend just got promoted to that level and is making that much, but maybe that friend's working at a big bank in New York, and it is, as you mentioned, so hard to get legit, specific live salary data. The market moves so fast. I mean, even in the last year, I've seen salaries for GRC come down while application security, DevSecOps has always been trending upwards, and DFIR has been bouncing around like crazy over the last couple of years. So that's a great point.
Well, we can take to your open-ended questions. We can take a lesson from the kind of Lean Six Sigma book and ask why a lot. So they have the concept of 5 whys, but you can take that and use it however you want. But so if somebody does say 200,000, you say, well, why is that the number? And drill down into, as you said, why. And then when they give you that answer, it should be, well, why is that? Why do you think that's the case? And so you can use those whys to drill down further and get those answers.
Well, and it's an opportunity too to find other ways to match somebody with a job. I've noticed, right. If you reveal a pain point about their current job, or figure out what their reason for getting out of bed in the morning is. Maybe it's their kids. Maybe it's they just enjoy the challenge of always being on call and instant response. Each person is wired a little bit differently. But to your point from earlier, emotional intelligence is so crucial. And I think a lot of leaders do lack that. I think because they've been they've gone through the trial by fire, and that's how they got their promotions in security. I think that's
Right.
kind of common. It's like, well, you were really good in that job, so we're going to promote you to the next level, and then you manage the people doing that job, which I've talked about with other guests in previous episodes. Sometimes that's not always the best strategy. Sometimes people are really good individual contributors, but it doesn't mean they're going to be a good leader. So
Right.
I guess aside from emotional intelligence, what other traits might you look for in the leaders that we're training?
Well, I think I think that it's passion more than anything for me, whether it be leaders or individual contributors. It has to do with passion. It has to do with desire. Obviously, we want hard work ethic. We want integrity. But that stability of personality, I look for all the time too. I teach my teams 4 rules to live by, 4 agreements that we have with each other and that I have for myself, which is that always have the highest integrity. So I'm looking for that honesty and integrity. So I'm looking for the person when I'm asking them questions, and it's clear that they don't know, that I also know that they're not running behind the scene trying to Google it to get the answer, and then kind of walking themselves around the answer. Just admit it, or say what you know and be done with it. So have that highest integrity. And then we talked a little bit about this, not taking things personally. You can see in talking to somebody whether how they're going to react to confrontational or crisis kind of situations. And we're going to have those all the time. It's just going to happen. Change, how they adapt to change. So an interesting technique in the interviewing would be to just take and do a 180 in the interview and go from just one subject and immediately just jumped 180 degrees to something different that has nothing to do with anything particular, because that's going to give you some measure of how they adapt to change and how they deal with the unknown and things like that. So, but nothing is personal. And the third is not to make assumptions. So if you get people that are starting to ask you questions, and this be a leader or be a candidate again, and you're asking them questions and they're answering the questions without getting enough information. So you purposely ask a question that's unclear and see if they will drill down and ask for additional clarification, or if they'll just make a bunch of assumptions and jump in and give you the answer they think you want. Because that's an indication of, are they making assumptions or are they making informed decisions based on observations? So that's another thing that we should look for. And then lastly is look for indicators that they're always willing to do their best and they're always willing to improve and grow. If they're not willing to improve and grow and they're not willing to give their best, then it's going to be problematic. So I look for those 4 things across the spectrum, leaders or not. Leaders have then the additional, are they well organized? Are they capable of being vulnerable and leading by example, creating a trusting environment, giving trust to other people to create that kind of a team success?
Yeah, that's great. Would love to pick up on the point about assumptions. That's one thing that I talk a lot about in the hiring process. Assumptions, biases, whatever you want to call it. I would say that's one of the primary drivers behind people not getting hired these days. Is hiring teams making assumptions about somebody based on sort of an archetype or a stereotype or something like that. If somebody's had a couple of short-term positions, they're a job hopper. Versus asking why. Maybe they got laid off in 2 jobs in a row and they're just really unlucky. That's happened a lot in the last couple of years. Maybe they didn't have all the experience that you're looking for in this particular role listed on the resume, but the recruiter talked to that person and said, look, they have this experience. They just didn't list it here. Take a chance on that person versus assuming they just don't have it. If anything, I've found over the years, people are awful resume writers, even if they're really, really good candidates, including executives, by the way. Been doing a lot of reviewing of resumes and things for executives these days. What are your thoughts on some common, I guess, assumptions that hiring teams might make?
Well, yeah, and that's only going to unfortunately get worse, so to speak, with AI coming in, because you, nobody has figured out yet how to take out completely any bias in AI. Because, well, frankly, AI is not really AI at this point. It's just an enhanced form of machine learning, and so it's going to have the bias of the programmers built into it somehow. So yes, obviously, job hopping is one. The one of the biggest ones that I find fascinating and I talk about a lot is when we talk about diversity and equity and inclusion, and we say, well, we're not getting enough, and I'll just pick, male versus female candidates, and but we don't think about the fact that we're putting 15 criteria in the job description that are you must, you must, you must, you must, you must. And the reality is that it would be a unicorn to find somebody that has those 15 you musts. But also, statistically, studies have been done that show that if a guy reads it and he meets, 8 out of 15, he's going to go, close enough, and he's going to apply. But many times, if a woman reads it and she doesn't meet 100% of all of them, she's going to say, well, I'm not qualified. And now, I don't know all the underlying reasons why that is, but that's been proven. So stop writing job descriptions that have so many must requirements, and start writing them as, this would be an added benefit kind of requirement, a preferred, an additional, and so forth. And I think you'll start to drive some of that difference in diversity there too. So I mean, that's a big one in my mind, where we eliminate candidates that way. Age, even though we're not discriminating on age, if you look at a candidate resume that comes in that is, hey, just a few years and just out of college versus somebody 10 years or 15 years, you're going to just automatically assume that they're better qualified for having more experience. And I would say that having more education and having more experience does not necessarily make that candidate better. Is it an indicator? Sure. Can it be a discriminator that says, if I have two candidates that appear to be exactly the same, well, maybe I should take the one that has more education, or the one that has more experience, or the one, whatever the case is, that lives closer to the office, or, whatever your criteria is. Sure. But stop assuming that because somebody got a degree that they know more. No, they got a degree because they had the time, the money, and the perseverance to get through the program.
Yeah, it's one thing to have correlations, like that in the aggregate, where, on average, degree holders are going to be, more conscientious than people that don't have degrees on average. But at the individual level, you have to treat each person like the individual they are. There could be so many good things about that person that don't meet your canned assumptions about that person. And keeping an open mind, and to your point from earlier, really keeping that job description brief. One of the things that you'd mentioned, women are less likely to apply to jobs that have a ton of requirements because they don't meet them. I've also read that research. That's absolutely true. How do you decide, though, what's going to be the few bullet points that are absolute must-haves when you need somebody to do everything?
Well, that's the business requirement. It's like, okay, if I have, three people that are each doing individual tools, and now I'm trying to eliminate my single points of failure for tool sets, then I look and I say, well, which of those is most critical, that if somebody's gone on vacation or something's not going to happen, that I have some backup for that. And I may make that one. That's my big deal. You must know Splunk, because I only got one person that knows it, and I can't get past that. But I won't say you got to know all these, because frankly, anybody that has the passion, the hard work, the intelligence, the capability, the desire, I can teach them tools all day long. So give me something, pick something that I need right away, knowing that I'm going to hire for the other qualities of the person that will allow them to pick up, and they'll have the desire to pick up the other techniques and tools and technologies later as we go. So I think that's all you do is you pick the thing that is most business critical at this moment in time. Hey, I don't have anybody right now that can do this particular tool. I have 2 or 3 people that are trying to just keep it limping along, but I need an expert. Well, then that has to be a critical skill. And that's how you decide that. It's a business requirement.
That's great. Yeah. And I hear, it seems like most folks I talk to on this podcast, they tend to stress the importance of soft skills. And you kind of touched on that as well. What do you rank more important, soft skills or the technical skills? And how do you decide for the specific role? Exactly.
Well, I think generally, if all other things were equal, I would lean towards soft skills because, ultimately we have such a changing environment. The hard skills that you have today, a requirement for today, may not be those hard skills that you have requirements for tomorrow. So I think in that way, in general, those soft skills are going to be more important. That passion and that ability to communicate, the ability to adapt to change, those kinds of things. However, you got to find the balance based on the business requirement. Again, if I have a missing piece and I've got to have somebody because we don't have anybody to manage a tool, and maybe I'm managing it myself temporarily because there's nobody else there. Well, then in that case, that hard skill is important, but not at the expense of soft skills. It's in my opinion, it's in addition to soft skills.
Yeah. It's always some combination of both, I think, right. In security, even for the GRC roles, it helps to have, some sort of technical knowledge and foundation to build on, which I often hear. We need more technical auditors. We need people that understand this stuff on a deeper level. So I kind of think there's often a tension between the desire to train junior folks and get them up to speed and everybody needing an expert. So, it necessarily they have to have some time in seat to get to that senior level. Any tips for companies that might be looking to build some sort of training program or talent pipeline?
Yeah. Well, and to your first point about like GRC folks having knowledge of that, I'm an advocate of the idea that the entire and let me qualify this by saying certifications are not the stamp of approval for everything. But having said that, I believe that an entire cyber team, if they don't already have some kind of other advanced certification, CISSP, CISM, whatever it is, GAC stuff, SAN stuff, whatever, that a person with absolutely none should take the training and take, for example, the Security Plus certification, if for no other reason than to give them common language to work within the environment. So I advocate requiring everybody to at least have that, not necessarily to be hired, but when they come on the team, if they don't have that, say they're a junior, a level 1 GRC analyst, risk analyst or something, well, then I'll put that in their first year goals, because let's face it, Security Plus training and certification is not horribly expensive. So that will be one of their first year goals is to take the training, get the Security Plus, and maybe it's just take the training and the exceeds expectation is getting the cert too. But that helps me ensure that everybody's kind of getting at least a basis in common language.
Yep, that's great. Have you ever had the chance to build entry-level pipelines and hire the junior folks?
Well, I have not. I don't generally haven't had the opportunity to build it from like we were talking about taking an internship program and then moving it forward. I mean, I had a little bit of that in a couple of companies, but frankly, most people on teams aren't around long enough to see that kind of pipeline evolve completely. What I have done, and I'm very big proponent of looking outside the cyber team and looking outside and looking internally outside the cyber team for getting candidates, especially for entry-level positions, but potentially for mid-level positions, depending on what they are. A little bit easier on the GRC side because that's more of a less of a knowledge specific at a lower level and more of a work ethic and soft skills point of view than on the technical side. But I've hired multiple people from, like desktop services to come over and be a risk analyst or to come over and be a security ops analyst, a starting entry level kind of role. I've hired, audit directors to come run compliance in the GRC component of the team and things like that. So I think we have lots of opportunity, especially within the IT community and the audit and compliance community, finance community, to bring people over into the cyber realm. So yes, we're missing that if we're not looking internally too.
Yeah, it actually seems to be relatively common. I've talked to quite a few folks on this podcast that have done that have looked in their own internal IT department and hired folks from there. I think that's one thing that a lot of job seekers that are looking to break into security don't realize is how many of these jobs are filled by companies hiring people internally or referrals. So when I do my career guidance calls, I try to set expectations with folks. Look, it's really more about networking at this level than it is really anything else. It's about who you know and what communities you're involved with, and getting involved in B-sides and being on the right Discord channels and finding a mentor and all these things that add up in this hyper competitive market. But yeah, we're coming up on time here, Patrick. So just one last question for you. Is there anything we're not talking about in the industry, but we should be, especially as it relates to hiring?
I think we're talking about plenty of stuff. I think that the leadership tract and training is something that we've talked about for decades in technology and now in cyber, and we've just never really addressed it. We have a lot of companies that have what I would call show pony leadership training. But they just don't really teach it or really mentor it. One of the best things I learned a long, long time ago too is we have to look at how we gain the skill set. So I look at it as three ways. You gain it through on the job experience, you gain it through formal education, or you gain it through mentoring. I look at on the job as about 70% of how you learn your skills. About 20% of it comes through mentoring and pure observation, and then mentoring from leadership and so forth. And only about 10% comes from formal education. But we tend to have this viewpoint that we got to take a course to get stuff done. And so our leadership programs in whether it be cyber or technology or otherwise tend to be focused towards take a course and then you're done. Okay, we told you everything in the course. Now you got to figure out how to use it. Instead of taking a course, following that up with a 6-month to a year mentorship program, and then following that up with specific on-the-job experience that you can point to put those skills into effect so that you have that full 100% view of things. Leadership program should be a multi-year program. It shouldn't be a 1-week course and then you're a leader and there you go. That's the way it was. So that's where I think we missed the boat.
Yeah, and I think you could say the same thing for training junior folks and individual contributors too.
Sure.
There's really no substitute for that hands-on time in seat experience where they're getting exposed to a variety of situations and generating wisdom out of those experiences. There's only so much you can compress into a classroom type of environment or something like that.
So and you learn by teaching. You learn by teaching too. So why not create the program such that they go to a formal course and then they come back into the team and you assign them, a cohort, a sponsor, a partner, however you want to look at it, that is already experienced. and you now that partner has been identified as having potential to be a leader sometime or a manager sometime. So they get the opportunity to start to learn, how do I interact with people and how do I teach people to do things? The other person gets the benefit of that mentorship program. And then at some point, the person that was teaching, maybe there's an opening for them to become a manager, and they've had a little bit of training in how to lead people. And the person then that was the mentee now can become a mentor for the next generation.
Yeah, and creating all of those sort of progressive steps up for people to move into those roles, whether it's in sort of a training sense or if it's in your organizational hierarchy, the more movement up and around that you can give people, the more engaged they stay and the better your retention will be.
Absolutely. Because they're invested. Yeah.
Yep, exactly. Well, that's a great point, Patrick. Good place to end. If people want to keep up with the work that you do, what's the best way to do so?
Probably on LinkedIn. I mean, you can message me on LinkedIn, and I'm happy to connect with almost anybody. I'll throw out the advice to vendors: don't send me a LinkedIn that says we have this product that we want to talk to you about, because I don't care. I really don't. We get hundreds of those a day, and so if you really want to connect, then connect with something meaningful that you want to learn or ask or engage in, and let's engage for a little bit of time. And I don't know what the perfect time is. I call it being tolerably persistent. Get to a point where we have some relationship and I know your name other than this is the guy that tried to sell me something. Because if that first message is telling me about your product, I probably deleted it. So.
Well, fair enough. And some great wisdom there for any vendors listening in. Well, appreciate your time, Patrick. And thanks, everybody.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Hello, everyone, and thanks for tuning in to this episode of the Talent Gap Fireside Chat. Don't forget to follow our page on LinkedIn and like and subscribe on Spotify and YouTube. Hit that notification bell to be notified when we drop a new episode. New episodes air every Friday at 4 p.m. Eastern.